Welcome everyone to the Shizou Akagi and Mary Foumal Memorial Webinar Series, Uplifting and Empowering Disabled Leaders Today and Tomorrow, brought to you by Linda K. Akagi and Associates with generous help from the Office of Civic and Community Life. I'm Dr. Aisha Musa, and I am here this evening with my colleague Linda Akagi and Sam Branazan, and our special guests, Endever Corbin and Kim Elliot. This is the second in our webinar series. You can find a video of our first webinar on YouTube at the Linda K. Akagi and Associates YouTube channel. Tonight, we're going to be talking about identifying and mitigating barriers and enabling achievement. Tonight's webinar will follow this format, the welcome and introductions, which we'll do in just a minute. We'll have our guest presentations, followed by a Q&A with our guests. And after that, a short break, and then we'll do some workshop activities. Since there aren't very many of us here tonight, I will ask each of us to introduce ourselves briefly and say what brought us to the webinar. And I will call on you in the order that you appear on my screen. I'll start. I'm Dr. Aisha Musa. Linda Akagi and I have been friends for many years, and we're the hosts of the webinar series. The first name on my participants list is Endever. Please introduce yourself.
My name is Endever, and I am one of the guest speakers. My friend Sam got me involved.
Thank you, Endever. Okay, next on my, and again, this is just the list. I see the names in the participant list. Kim Elliot, please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Kim Elliot, and I'm one of the guest speakers along with Endever. And like Endever, both Sam and Linda, I have known for a long time, and they got me connected. So happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. Okay, Linda, you're up. Thank you, Linda. Okay, Sam, you're up. Sam V.
Sorry, Sam's having a hard time getting to where he wants, but Sam's a long-time colleague of Aisha and Linda.
Wada, please introduce yourself.
Thank you for having me here today. This is Wada. I'm a T6 spinal cord injury, and I go by he, him. I know Linda for almost 30 years. It's been a while. And I know Aisha through advocacy work. Thank you.
Wow, you've known Linda. Linda and I have known each other about 45 or 40 some years now. So, but you've known Linda almost as long as I have. Welcome, Marlon. We were just introducing ourselves, so you're right on time. Just give us your name and say a little bit about what brought you here.
Hello, everyone. My name is Marlon Marion. I'm the Equity and Inclusion Manager for the Portland Police Bureau. I was hoping to be here for the whole time. I'm sorry for being late. And I have another meeting I'm going to have to jump into soon, but I'm just looking for ways to better show up around these issues that we are having in this space within our Bureau. We were recently sued for not being able to have considerations during our protest in 2020. And I'm just trying to figure out what I can learn and bring back to that space. So I'm happy to be here.
Well, welcome. We're glad to have you. And we've actually just been doing introductions, so you have not missed the major presentation. I was just going over tonight's agenda. Let me share my screen again so you can see where we were. This is what we've done. We just did our introductions and overview. This, as I said, this is our second webinar, Identifying and Mitigating Barriers and Enabling Achievement. To recap our goals for this webinar series, and we anticipate one more webinar in the series, it's about recognizing the potential of disabled people. Linda and I realized many years ago that not only do non-disabled people have very low expectations of disabled people, often disabled people have very low expectations of themselves. So we want to encourage and recognize potential, raise expectations, identify barriers, and mitigate barriers. Our underlying and overarching idea is the social model of disability, which says that we are more disabled by the barriers in society than we are by our bodies or our diagnoses. These are our key takeaways from the first webinar. We want you to see us as people, full people like everyone else. See us as people, not as objects. Listen to us when we tell you about our lives, about our experiences. See us as people and listen to us. Education is key. Supportive communities are key, and proper equipment is key. And this is true not only for disabled people, but non-disabled people. We want to stress that as well. And tonight we'll be talking about education, supportive communities, and proper equipment, with a focus on supportive communities and proper equipment. Now, what do we mean by supportive communities? Supportive communities is literally everyone we interact with in our lives, our families, our teachers, our doctors, our therapists of all sorts, whether it's physical, occupational, speech, etc. Then there are engineers and designers who design equipment and create equipment that can assist us, the assistive technology. And because we have someone with law enforcement who's joined us, don't think that we left you out of this list. This was just a basic list. Anyone we interact with in the community, whatever service they're providing, can be part of our supportive community. We want to stress the need for proper tools and equipment, and they're necessary for any task for anybody. This is not true of just disabled people. This is true for anyone. If you want to build a house or cook a meal or write a book, whatever you want to do, you need the proper tools and equipment. For example, in school, pencil and paper. We give all children in school pencil and paper because they're communication devices. And our special guests tonight will be talking about other kinds of communication devices. But it's not only disabled children who need communication devices. The type we're talking about tonight are not the only kind of communication devices. We all use communication devices of one sort or another. Pencil and paper is probably the most common example. And we give all children in school communication devices. Proper equipment and tools, as I said, are also needed for any task. Everyone needs proper tools and equipment for whatever they are doing. The difference for disabled people, some people's needs are normalized and others are not. And one of the things we want to shift in our discussion is the term special needs. We discussed this in detail in our previous webinar. The difference between normal needs and special needs is problematic because that otherizes disabled people. Lack of proper tools and equipment is disabling, and access to proper tools and equipment is enabling for everyone, not only for people that are disabled. People are disabled when their needs are not normalized. And again, this is a theme we're going to stress throughout our webinar series. Likewise, education and training is necessary for everyone for any task or endeavor. If you cook, You learned how to cook. If you drive, you had to learn how to drive. If you have a job, you had to learn how to do that job. And you learn different things that you need to do within that job. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter if you are considered normal, if you're considered disabled. This is something everyone needs. Again, people are disabled when their needs are not normalized. Lack of or limited access to education and training is disabling, and full access to education and training is enabling. Those are the points that we're stressing throughout our webinar series. Tonight, we have two special guests presenting. We have Endever Corbin and Kim Elliot. Endever Corbin is queer, trans, low income, mostly nonverbal autistic who loves talking about the communication tools that help them. And Kim Elliot is a speech language pathologist and certified assistive technology professional, passionate about making our world a more accessible and inclusive home to all. She works toward the goal by working with people with disabilities to find AT tools to empower them to fully participate in their lives in the ways in which they choose. She works as the director of programs and services at Community Vision, a local nonprofit that shares her vision. With that, I will turn it over to our first special guest of the evening, Endever Corbin.
Hi everyone. Like Aisha said, I'm Endever. My pronouns are they, them, theirs, or z, them, theirs. Happy to be here today. Just to give you an outline, right now I'm going to talk about disability-related barriers I've experienced and the consequences of them in my life. Then after my friend Kim gives her presentation, I'll come back on to tell you about the tools and supports that break down the barriers and the successes I've experienced due to them. In the disability community, many people talk about physical barriers we experience due to structural ableism. For example, not being able to get into a building because there isn't a ramp, or not being able to read a handout because it is not large print. Today, I'm going to talk partly about a different kind of barrier I've experienced as an autistic person, a societal belief or value system. I think these are sometimes less obvious and harder to name or describe than tangible barriers ableism presents us with. In the example I'll go over today, this societal belief is that mouthwords, or oral speech, is a superior form of communication. And not only is everyone expected to speak, we're supposed to do it correctly, pronouncing things the same way as non-disabled people. Growing up, I was surrounded by people pressuring me to catch up and start speaking, and once I did, to fix my mouthwords to sound like neurotypicals. It is indeed a barrier that this is the typical focus for children in speech therapy, and that no alternatives are offered. All I could do was force myself to speak, no matter how ineffective or uncomfortable. Of course, this is not the only societal belief that tends to be a barrier for autistic people. Often we absorb all the messages that we need to change our natural way of existing, as a way of keeping ourselves safe and making sure we fit into the crowd. We learn to hide the behaviors, social norms, interests, and ways of connecting that are normal for us, just in order to get by. This is what I did, when young, with mouthwords. I did eventually started using them, and then after years of speech therapy began to articulate them correctly. I even internalized the belief that mouthwords were the best way to communicate. So, everything was fine, right? No, everything was definitely not fine. Learning to speak didn't mean it ever became easier. In fact, as abled people trained me to pronounce things the way they thought I should, I think it actually became harder and harder. My friend Alyssa co-authored a paper about autistic adults who use speech in AAC. They are also a part-time AAC user, that is, someone who uses both mouthwords and alternative communication methods, such as assistive technology. One important feature of this seminal paper is their description of 3 kinds of speech autistic people may experience. To summarize those, intermittent speech comes and goes, unreliable speech doesn't represent our true message, and insufficient speech isn't enough to cover what we'd like to say. I am intimately familiar with all these types of autistic speech. For example, I can speak some days but not others, and in some situations but not others. And what comes out of my mouth doesn't always match what I want to say. Or, I can speak about special interests more easily, but tend to go silent when trying to form mouth words about my emotions. Intermittent, unreliable, and insufficient. If you speak full time and easily, take a minute to think about how your whole life would be different if your speech was different in these ways. Would others treat you like a peer? Would your doctor believe that you can report your own symptoms? Would your teachers believe that you have a future? Remember, this is about how society disables us as people with brains and bodies that are considered atypical. And what about if you didn't have any mouth words at all? How would society disable you then? Now, what I think might be an important addition or postscript to this 3-pronged model of autistic speech difficulties that Zisk and Dalton propose is a certain concept I have of exhausting speech, or speech fatigue, or some other name I haven't thought of yet. This experience was especially devastating for me when I was trying to use mouth words all the time. It takes immense concentration for some of us to manage to keep up with a conversation, decide what we want to say, figure out how to say it in a way that will be understood, find a good moment to say it that won't be seen as interrupting, and then successfully coordinate the minuscule muscle movements required of the mouth and throat to produce sounds that will be understood as meaningful language. The experience of speech fatigue has had a massive impact on me, and I've heard very much the same from other autistic AAC users. For example, I strongly believe it contributed to the series of autistic burnouts I've gone through. Autistic burnout, if you don't know, is a period of time where we lose skills we once had, either temporarily or permanently, usually due to an extended amount of masking our autistic traits. Back into adolescence, I had begun to even inflict the speech is superior idea onto myself, after years of imbibing it from society. So I didn't give myself any leeway or understanding. I took jobs such as food service just like anyone else would, as if they would be sustainable for me. They weren't. After years of trying to mask my neurodivergent traits, blend in, act like everyone else, and of course, use mouthwords, the facade always eventually fell, over and over. For one thing, I found that autistic burnouts can trigger or exacerbate episodes of my co-occurring conditions. So I left behind me a trail of abandoned jobs, friends, and relationships as the mix of my other illnesses and the autistic burnouts themselves added up. My increased difficulty socializing, more frequent and lengthy non-communicative periods, exhaustion and malaise, hospital trips, heavy medication, and so on affected every aspect of my life even more intensely than just being autistic on a good day just to begin with. Even without my other diagnoses contributing, the burnouts impacted my ability to function day to day. And I do think I've permanently lost some skills due to them, including that my tolerance for forcing speech seems worse now. But the real key here is that the world around me was not giving me the supports I needed to go on living my life successfully despite these experiences. I did not have access to adaptive technology, or even cognitive hacks or support staff or logistical accommodations that might help me do the things I wanted to do. When it was clear people thought my periods of silent note writing were weird, all I could do was assume they were right. You see, I didn't understand myself as autistic at that time, and wasn't familiar with disability justice concepts that might have reframed the way I was looking at my situation. As far as I knew, I was just weird and sick and broken, and that was the end of it. I didn't have a community of people with similar experiences around me to say, hey, maybe the problem is in your brain. Maybe the problem is societal ableism having set up a world in which you're not getting the assistive aids and tools you need. Okay, Here's where I'm stopping my story for a bit, because my friend Kim is going to talk to you about supports such as assistive technology tools and where to start finding the right ones.
Thank you, Endeavor. Thank you so much. I'm going to start talking about where do we start when we're looking at tools. And it sounds a little corny that we start with the heart, but it really is true that we have to start with a belief in the person and in their right to be included and to participate in their lives fully. For communication, a belief that the person has something to say and it's as valuable as anyone else's thoughts or feelings, and to believe in their possibilities. So, like I said, it seems a little corny sometimes to say that, but it's very, very true. As a professional, I have met other professionals who've had lots of training, but if they don't have that belief in the person and in possibilities, the tools tend to not be very successful, or they lowball them, or they do things like Endeavor experienced where something else is forced upon them. And then the person's failure then is put on them and not on the person who was supposed to be supporting them and finding the right tools. So really starting with the heart is important. That being said, I've also met people who have no training and they love and believe in a person, and they have found incredible creative supports naturally that really work for the person. So really starting with that belief, both in the person's possibility, but also in their right to participate in their lives. That's where we start. Oops. And then, of course, everything has to start with that person. We have to find out, what do they love? What are their ambitions? What are their passions? What do they want to do? What is important to them in their lives? In the first webinar of this series, Aisha and Linda talked about that, right? Finding the ambitions and really encouraging somebody to look beyond what's in the here and now and look to the future, what they want, what their hopes and dreams are. And also looking at the person's whole life, you know, what's important to them? Where do they want to be more involved without us starting from a thought about what we think is good for them? It has to be very person-centered. So you believe in the person, and then you start talking to and digging in with that person. So when you do find those things, what helps someone be successful? It can be a multitude of things. Generally, we think of people, strategies, environment, and tools, right? So who are the people in that person's, who are those natural supports, and what can those people do to help bridge and be a support? Looking at strategies, sometimes simply giving somebody some time to process and think and then respond. It could be as simple as that, and just slowing down a little bit, maybe giving some gestural supports or visual supports, lots of different strategies that could be helpful. And then looking at the environment as well. How is it set up to help someone be as regulated from a sensory standpoint as possible? Things like lighting, smell, sound, comfort, other things in the environment that could help. But what we're talking about a little more tonight are the tools. And specifically, given Endeavor's life experience and my training, we're talking specifically around communication tools. And those are very often not just one single tool. Okay, we all communicate in many different ways, right? Sometimes I might just nod my head. Other times I'll say, yeah. I might wave across to a neighbor to say hello. I text, I type, I email, talk on the phone. There's lots and lots of different ways to communicate. And for those people who communicate not always using speech, there also has to be multiple modes. And those could be in picture cards. Those could be in a device that has voice output. Sometimes there might be speech, sometimes there might be sign or gesture, lots of different ways. And we look at that whole picture as a system for those communication tools, and really letting that, being focused on the person and what works best for them. Again, sometimes professionals like to decide what they think is best, and really we need to find the tools that work best for the person and not have preconceived ideas about what those should be. And also, what's a better communication mode than another? A lot of times people think a device with voice output is better than something else, and that is not true at all. It all works together for the person. And then I want to emphasize what Aisha said earlier, we all use tools, right? We don't think of it as a luxury. If I'm painting my wall, I don't think, wow, I'm so lucky to have a paintbrush, right? It's what I need to get the job done. We're starting to feel that way about our phones now, our smartphones, being on the internet and communicating. It's hard to imagine what it would be like without some of those tools. So just remembering, we all use tools. Some of these tools might be less familiar and look a little different, but everyone needs a multitude of different tools depending on what it is that they're doing. So I'm going to go back to, say, the communication device versus maybe using some sign or some pictures, depending on who you're communicating with and what the environment is. Some of those tools might be more effective than others. And Endeavor is going to speak a little more about their specific tools after I'm done. And I want to say that assistive technology used to be seen as kind of a last resort. We try everything else, and when everything else fails, we end up with assistive technology. And the problem with this is then we let years of failure happen, and people then internalize that as a problem with them. Like, I can't do what is being asked of me. I'm not being given these tools, therefore I am a failure. Endeavor's experience really demonstrates how damaging that can be for a person. Imagine if those tools had been made available earlier in your life, Endeavor, right? A lot of pain and internalized negative feelings would have been avoided. So luckily, nowadays, there are a bulk of people now thinking of AT no longer as a last resort, but really a first resort. We have this bridge with a gap. Okay, somebody wants to do something and they don't have that piece to help them cross over to the other side. And so instead of waiting for a last resort, we are now seeing AT is a bridge to building those skills. And the beautiful thing about this is you start building success early on. We sometimes start with very, very young children, like infants still, and start introducing some of those tools. And as they have experience and can do the things that they need to do because they have the tools they need, that builds their own self-confidence about what they can do in the world. And then of course promotes, right, a future that feels much brighter and that gives them the confidence that they can do what they want to do. So with that, I want to share a couple of success stories for people I know. This boy, Reed, his parents started where I said. They loved him, they believed in him, they believed in his right to have agency in his own life, to communicate. And so they dedicated themselves very early on. When he was a preschooler is when I met him, and they were determined they were going to get a communication system established for him. And so they started early on with a communication book. While he was figuring out his body, he has quadriplegic cerebral palsy and couldn't use his hands to select anything. And so we looked at lots of different ways to access a communication device. And he ended up doing really well with eye gaze, and now he is a very successful third grader who is fully integrated in a general education classroom, and he reads and he writes and he composes and he does math and he does all of the things that his peers in his classroom do, and is a very autonomous young man with a lot of agency in his life. And so he has a great, bright future because people believed in him, and then he was given the tools and training that he needed to achieve. I also want to talk about my friend Joni, who is in her 60s. I want to point out that it's, even if you don't start early, it's never too late. Joni had never had a communication system or a book or anything. She used some sign to communicate. As she got older, she started to lose some of her signs, but the people who work with her in her group home, her support people, they loved her and they believed in her, and they believed that Joni, even though her communication skills started to decrease, they believed she had a right to speak her mind, and they wanted to find a way for her to be able to communicate. And so they came to see us at the Assistive Technology Lab, and we looked at some communication devices and we tried different things, but the thing that really spoke to Joni was a communication book with pictures in it that had very important things for her to say, a variety of different things. And now in her 60s, she's got her first communication book, and her communication is better now than ever in her group home, and she's doing great with it. So I wanted to point out these two ends of the spectrum, that it's best to start early, but it's never too late to start. And with that, I will give it back to Endeavor.
Thanks, Kim. What I want to talk about in this next section is the tech, tools, training, and proud disabled communities that act as supports for me encountering the barriers I talked about earlier. It's these supports that enable me to be successful in what I want to do. First, let's go over the tech and tools I use for AAC that are more physical. I use many different kinds of AAC to help me communicate without having to force mouth words. Kim is going to pull up a quick visual example for you now. This is probably my main form of face-to-face communication these days. It's a symbol-based speech-generating app called Proloco 2 Go installed on an iPad. I have it in a heavy case and shoulder strap so that I can easily bring it with me wherever I go without damage. I can even send messages on social media by selecting pictures on this and then pasting the corresponding text into other apps. And it's really customizable. For example, I've heavily color-coded my buttons to make it easier for me to locate them, and I created a keyboard section on this home screen you see here instead of using the one built in elsewhere that I find difficult to use. Thanks, Kim. You can switch that off now. If anyone has questions about it, we can pull it up again during the Q&A. Sign language is my other most preferred way of communicating face-to-face, but since most people don't understand it, I don't get to use it as much as I'd like. I'm also not fluent in actual ASL yet. I currently sign more like a pigeon, so sometimes it's hard to explain myself accurately. As backup communication methods, I type my messages on a QWERTY keyboard style app on my phone, and point to letters arranged on laminated letter boards. Sometimes I gesture non-linguistically or make vocal word approximations that are easier for me to produce than proper mouth words. People who know me well are most likely to understand these. And then, I do still speak occasionally, well, usually just when talking to family. There's so much less stress on my brain now from using AAC the rest of the time, that it makes occasional mouth words more sustainable to do on a very intermittent basis. I can't emphasize enough, it's so lovely to be able to choose my own forms of communication now. Compared to that early period where everyone around me wanted me to speak with non-disabled pronunciation, I feel much more free to honor my own needs when it comes to how I communicate. All the different communication supports I just listed open up a whole new world to me in which I can express myself effectively. Thinking back to that list of different types of autistic speech, well, my communication no longer is to be intermittent. It's more accurate to what I actually want to say, and I can talk about more variety of the things that are important to me. And what about speech fatigue? Honestly, it's usually more of a memory now that I have other tools. I still get tired and may experience meltdowns after the now shorter periods that I have to use mouthwords. But it isn't an everyday feature of my life anymore to experience exhaustion from every face-to-face social interaction I find myself in. For example, I am often actually energized by conversations in sign language, and I feel confident and assured about what I'm saying when I use my iPad. It helps me take the time I need to think through exactly what I want to say when my communication partners are patient. It's important to me, and to many other autistic AAC users I know, to have free choice between our chosen communication supports at all times. Sometimes our brains might work better with symbols versus text, whole words versus spelling, switch scanning rather than touch screen, low tech versus high tech, or any number of other differentiated features of each communication tool that can impact which we can use most effectively in a given moment. That includes being able to switch back and forth from AAC to speech at will, and without invalidation. The idea of communication partners being patient, and allowing us to switch our communication methods freely without invalidation. That actually brings us back to my introductory thoughts on societal attitudes as a barrier to equitable participation in public life for disabled people. Even once we've finally got our own AAC, the beliefs and values about communication that people near us hold can deeply impact the communicative success of disabled people who need technology or other tools to express themselves. And really, that's just an extension of the ableist attitudes that pressured me to speak in the first place. So, while tangible communication supports such AAC have opened up a new world of successful communication and life satisfaction for me, the attitudinal barriers promoting the idea that mouthwords are a superior form of communication are still out there. What tools, training, and other supports have countered these barriers in my life? The biggest answer is the autistic AAC community I've connected with. Before I met people in that community, I didn't even know AAC existed. I had been writing notes instead of speaking off and on for years, but hadn't heard of formal AAC, and certainly didn't know that Spanish-speaking autistics had just as much right to use it as fully non-speaking folks. All that changed when I finally accepted my diagnosis and got involved in dedicated autistic space, where I met AAC users. In fact, it wasn't a speech-language therapist, or an AT specialist, or a professional of any kind to be the one to introduce me to AAC or suggest it might be helpful. That was all from fellow autistic people. They believed in me. They stayed in touch with me online and gave me advice on how to trial, choose, afford, and use the system that would work for me. They, in fact, have been the majority of my training on how to use my various communication tools, because they use similar ones. They've shared letterboards with me, acted as my tech support, and suggested customizations to Proloco to go that help me navigate it more intuitively. Having good training is a crucial part of using assistive technology to improve our lives as disabled people. But I'd like to point out, too, that the impact of this community on me has been even larger than the practicalities of tech access and training. This is where the attitudes and beliefs about mouthwords shoved down my throat can finally be fought off. Because the values of the autistic AAC community, or at least what I know of it, are clear. Speech is in no way a superior form of communication. Everyone can communicate. There is no correct way to express a message. And everyone deserves AAC. Now that I am fully integrated into this community, surrounded by its values and positive messaging daily, I am able to reject mouthwords as the sole measure of communicative success. I now live in a community where the old societal barriers that shape so much of my life have long been taken apart. They hold less and less sway over us every day. Moreover, We are growing our power as a community. We directly help other autistic people of all ages get access to communication supports and learn how to use them. We educate parents about AAC and how to introduce it to their children. We are recently carving out a place for ourselves in academia, and already we give so many presentations like this in community settings. We advocate with professionals like speech therapists about how they should be offering access to AAC as early as possible, and we advocate with professionals like doctors about how they can provide competent medical care to those of us who can't rely on mouth words alone to be understood. So maybe it isn't exactly assistive technology, but truly a huge tool against the ableist barriers I face is in fact just people. People changing minds and willing to change their own. People who reject mainstream attitudes about non-speaking and Spanish-speaking autistics. People who fill me up with the defiance necessary to use AAC even when I'm around others who still believe in that old hierarchy of communication. I'm enabled by both my AAC and my community of peers. Now I just want to tell you about some of my recent successes now that I finally have AAC, other accessibility tools, and the community I just described. First of all, I use my communication aids to successfully access medical care for my co-occurring conditions. I sometimes bring my support worker to help me self-advocate and manage anxiety, but usually I can attend appointments on my own using my AAC device or a sign language interpreter to communicate. I am more empowered to stand up for myself, fully convey my medical history, and ask questions about medications and other treatments. I am also able to maintain friendships better now, something that often isn't very easy for autistic people. Most of my friends are online, but to us that's just as valid as offline friendships. And when you think about it, typing back and forth through computers or text messages is basically just a societally acceptable form of AAC. I have taught people who do see me face to face how to interact with me respectfully if I'm communicating differently than they're used to. And building individual friendships with others who use AAC has taught me so much about all different kinds of assistive aids people use in their own lives and conversations. I also have a small online business selling crafts I make. I don't earn much money from this, so I still rely on Social Security, but it is rewarding to be able to make things that people appreciate. I am proud that I have kept it going for a while now. It's a much better fit for me than in-person jobs for many reasons. It's normal for all communication with customers to be done through text-based direct messages. I don't have to show up at a certain place at a certain time every day to spend hours interacting with people face to face. I can work at my own speed and set boundaries around how many orders I can handle at a time. And when I occasionally need to go to the post office to ship something to another country, I can use AAC or sign to successfully communicate with the clerk. As a bonus, a lot of what I sell are pins that have phrases about disability rights, access needs, diagnosis disclosure, and status badges. So I get a lot of disabled customers who really appreciate my work. It feels like giving back to the community. Another success I attribute to having AAC and other disability supports now is that I give presentations like this regularly now. I especially like to talk about AAC, but depending on the organization's needs, I often brought in my writing into additional topics like autism and disability rights. It is amazing to be able to share my experiences with groups of other people, and even more amazing to get good feedback. Attendees seem to really value what I have to say, and so do co-presenters I've worked with, so it means a lot to me to be able to do presentations. The last success I'll talk about today is the academic work I've stumbled into. The speech-language pathology professor I met when I was taking occasional classes at my local university invited me to be the community research partner for a qualitative research study on speaking autistic adults who also use AAC. It was small and very preliminary, the first study on this demographic that we know of, but it is making big waves. Since the paper was published last year, we had presented our data as part of a master class at a professional SLP conference, as well as an online AAC conference. We have been getting additional requests to share our findings with schools and professionals from all over. And now we are working on a tutorial paper regarding access to AAC for school children. It is simply amazing to be part of finding and sharing formal data that reflects my experiences. Data that will hopefully break down the barriers other Spanish-speaking and non-speaking autistic people still face. Okay, thanks for listening, folks. Before I go, I just want to offer you a list of further resources regarding the subjects I talked about. Kim, can you pull that up, please? Thank you.